the toad was listed as endangered in 1994, and at that time the known distribution was all the way down into Baja, Mexico, and then on up into San Luis Obispo County. Actually, it's been extirpated from San Luis Obispo County. They're not known from there anymore. And the listing document that describes it as endangered describes that there were potentially viable populations in 8 drainages only at that time. And it was listed on the heels of a pretty significant drought in Southern California in the early 1990s. And so, for example, in 1990, only 7 pairs of arroyo toads were known to breed. So it looked kind of dire at that time. Then in 1996, a population was found in Monterey County up here on Fort Hunter Liggett, owned by the Army. And that was a pretty significant range expansion, or expansion to its known range. That's 100 miles north of the next nearest population to the south. Then in 1999, the recovery plan for the toad was finalized. And the recovery plan outlines or describes 22 drainages that were known to be occupied by the arroyo toad. And it lists those drainages. I think in part because the drought had ceased after the early 90s and breeding picked up again for the arroyo toad, and because people started to look for them more in earnest because it was listed, we started to know better where it was, and more populations were found. The recovery plan describes that 20 self-sustaining populations need to be protected and identified for the toad to be downlisted from endangered to threatened. And it describes 20 populations on federal lands where those are the populations that need to be protected and self-sustaining before it can be downlisted. And in the recovery plan, it also split up the range and the populations of toads into 3 recovery units: the northern, southern, and desert recovery units. And with this little blue dotted line, I've kind of shown the division between those recovery units. The highest density of arroyo toad populations are here in the southern recovery unit. There are 3 desert recovery unit populations. Those are on the fringe of the Mojave Desert in streams that drain into the Mojave Desert. All the other populations are in coastal streams. In 2001, critical habitat was designated for the species, and it was divided up into 22 critical habitat units. Some of those units had subunits. But that was challenged, and it was vacated by the court in 2002, so it only stood for a year and a half. And the judge told us we've got to redo critical habitat. So in 2004, we started that process again, and I was heavily involved with that. And we based our new effort on the previous critical habitat, because that was challenged because of the economic analysis, which was found to be deficient. The biology was sound the first time around, so we used that as a template for the critical habitat that was just designated. But we added a unit. Now it has 23 units, and this is the new unit right there. That's the Cajon Wash population of toads. They were found within the last couple of years. That's along I-15, basically. So this map shows, well, it's all the known populations of arroyo toads, a few small areas where toads are known to be might be left out, but this captures all of the significant populations of arroyo toads. And this map is showing what we determined was habitat that was essential to the conservation of the species. So you'll note that most all of these populations, if you can tell, are on federal lands, or a lot of them are on federal land, mostly Forest Service land, but also military lands, one on BLM land. And most of these 23 units were actually proposed as critical habitat. Then in 2005, just last year, critical habitat was finalized, but you'll see that only 6 of those 23 units actually made it to the final stage and became critical habitat. Most of the others were reasons or for military exemptions or military readiness reasons. Those decisions are made at the highest level in the Department of Interior. And I should point out that arroyo toad individuals are still protected under the Endangered Species Act wherever they're found, whether they're in critical habitat or not. So if we put critical habitat aside and then look at the arroyo toad populations themselves, I wanted to know, well, where are the large, robust, viable, or potentially viable populations of arroyo toads? And I came up with 22 potentially viable populations that the decision hasn't been made, or the analysis hasn't been done to determine if these are actually viable populations or not, if they're self-sustaining or not. But if any are, it's likely to be these. And they range in size from fairly small, like this population here at Castaic Creek. It's only about 1.5 miles of river that's occupied by toads, but they're reliably found there every year, and they do quite well, and hundreds of metamorphs are produced there every year, or at least when it's a non-drought year. And it ranges up to larger populations like Sespe Creek here, where in a good year, like a couple years ago, many thousands of metamorphs were produced in that population, and hundreds of adults are found in that stretch of river, and it's approximately 17 miles of river that's occupied by arroyo toads. Most of these populations are on federal lands and are protected to some extent, but there are some significant ones that are completely on private lands as well, especially down here in San Diego County. Can I get the next slide? Thanks. And this is just showing, it's very similar to the last slide, but I wanted to focus on those populations that are on federal lands, or at least partly on federal land, because the recovery plan calls for 20 populations to be protected on federal lands, as I mentioned before, for downlisting. And actually 15 additional populations would be needed beyond those to completely delist the toad. So I come up with approximately 18 potentially self-sustaining populations, largely or partly on federal lands, that might rise to the level of being viable, and so we're close possibly to a downlisting situation, but that analysis would have to be done. Delisting the toad at this point. So overall, it's hanging in there. It's actually doing pretty well in these areas. I should also mention that these 18 populations and that last slide with the 22 potentially viable populations, that leaves out about a dozen or 15 small populations, if you can call them populations, where arroyo toads have been found, but they're probably not in a viable situation.